If we have a dog who pulls like a freight train, we need to get behind the why. We need to find out the reason and train so that we address the reason and not just the symptom. In today's case, we talk about Giselle, a golden doodle, 1.5 years old, and she was pulling like crazy, only with mom, which is curious, right? And mom felt like she had tried everything she could without hurting or scaring her dog. She didn't want to do that, so she felt like there was nothing else she could do. This is very common, right? So stay tuned and have fun with this episode of A Dog's Soul, an empath guide to your dog's feelings. Alright, so as I said, it's really common for young dogs to start pulling like crazy, right? And people try so many things because it's draining, at least. With very heavy dogs, very strong dogs, it's not only draining, it's also very painful, right? Feels like your arm gets pulled out of its socket. So this is really something that cannot go on for long, and it is stressful for the dog as well, especially if the dog is on a collar, which I would never recommend. So if you have a dog who pulls, please use a well-fitting harness so that your dog does not damage any structures in the neck area. And that happens more often than not. So it doesn't have to be something huge. It can be something little, like sore muscles. But the more uncomfortable our dogs are, the less they can actually cooperate with us, the less they can listen to us. So we need a dog who is feeling well. And that is also the first point that we have to consider when we have a dog who pulls like crazy. Is that dog feeling well? So for Giselle, the golden doodle, a vet check was in order. But her mom felt like this was not necessary because they had their annual appointment just a few weeks before she decided to start training again. And the vet said everything was all right. So I think it's always a good idea to put a vet check first. And if there is anything that looks suspicious, a change in the gait or any change in behavior, like the dog is suddenly showing signs of aggression or suddenly doesn't want to jump into the car or out of the car, or doesn't want to walk stairs or anything like that, or even doesn't want to get pet as much as before or not in a specific area, things like that. All of those were not the case with Giselle. So mom felt like this was not the reason for her pulling. Also, her pulling hasn't gotten worse, and it had started when she was about 5 to 6 months old. So the typical puberty craziness pulling, if you want to call it that. Because a lot of dogs start pulling when they reach puberty. Some of them did pull before as puppies, but the humans didn't realize it that much because a puppy isn't that heavy, right? So it gets noticed when the dog gets a little bit older and also a little bit more interested in the surroundings and starts to have a higher stress level. We can never forget that however annoyed we are with our teenage dogs or teenage humans, right? They have a lot to deal with themselves. Puberty, adolescence is not that easy for an individual. Maybe you remember your own puberty and adolescent phase. It was not that easy. Hormones are going crazy, the body is changing rapidly fast, and things can be overwhelming. New things become interesting that haven't been interesting before, like the opposite sex, right? It's the same thing for dogs. They often start getting interested in wildlife as well during that phase. So they have to deal with all these new exciting smells and impressions they get when they are outside. And again, the inside turmoil as well, right? Because hormones are rampaging. So the stress level with all of that is, of course, higher. That is just logical, right? So we cannot expect our dogs to be with us 100%. They have to deal with their own stuff as well. So, what I like to do during the teenage years, months, depending on the dog, is to just take it easy. It's a lot more bearable if we just take a step back and take the pressure off and try to laugh about it. All right. But things like pulling on the leash excessively, we cannot just laugh away, right? And to be honest, it usually doesn't get better on its own, even if the dog grows out of adolescence and the teenage years. So we have to address it. The difference is if we train with an adult dog, we can ask a little bit more if the stress level is lower. For a teenager, the stress level is higher from the beginning, even if we get the stress down. So we have to adjust the training a little bit to teenage needs. So shorter training periods, higher value rewards, and just keeping it light. All right? Making it as easy as possible. So for Giselle, she was really trying. She was really trying to listen to mom, but she had connected the leash with so much frustration because the leash was keeping her from getting to where she wanted to go as fast as she wanted to go there, and also was keeping her from just running up to her friends. And she had learned as a puppy that that is what you do whenever you see another dog, right? Because she was allowed to run up to every other dog. And in puppy class, every session started with just wild play. So the puppies got there, were off leash, and immediately started playing with each other and ignoring the moms and dads there, right? That is still typical in many puppy classes, and this is an experience so many dogs make. So if you have a puppy, don't do that. Train your puppy to still be connected to you whenever they see another dog. That is so important in later in life, right? But all right, Giselle had already learned that other dogs are very exciting. So, of course, the pulling was worse whenever she saw another dog, and the frustration piled up and up and up. So, she was also a high risk of becoming leash reactive due to frustration, which is one of the most common feelings behind this, right? So, it was a really good idea to start training again. But the training Giselle's mom had done before was to do the typical stop and go. So whenever Giselle started pulling, she would stop and wait for Giselle to at least look at her or come back to her and then continue walking. Of course, that was extremely frustrating, not only for Giselle, but also her mom, right? If you have tried that, it's like enragingly frustrating. Same goes for turning around. Like every time Giselle pulled, her mom would just turn around and walk a different direction. Again, if this is done on a harness, it's annoying like hell for both. if it's done on a collar, it can actually damage things. So the abrupt yank on a leash when you turn around and walk in the different direction is like if you're giving a leash correction. This is something that over time will definitely have an impact on the structures on the neck of the dog. So it's uncomfortable for the dog, it's annoying, it's very frustrating. So most of the time people don't stick with it, which is, in my opinion, a good thing. But for training, if you switch methods all the time, none of them has any chance of unfolding its potential. And I'm not saying that these two methods have any potential. I'm just saying that if you pick and choose a method, you have to stick with it. So choose one that you can actually stick with. That's why I would not train like that. For me, I don't like things that are just frustrating as hell. So, all right, what we did was, first of all, not only address the leash pulling issue. We had to get Giselle's stress level down because in adolescence, she, as we already said, had a higher stress level. And also, they took her everywhere with them, which for puppies is a good thing if it's not too much. But for teenagers, it can become too much a lot faster than for a puppy. So we switched the walking area to outside the town they were living in. So they didn't have so many smells, they didn't have to meet so many other dogs and people and all those things. They shortened the walks a lot and they stopped throwing stuff. That is another huge thing because throwing stuff gets the dog very excited, right? And most of the time, there is no cool down after that. And the cool down would have to be a lot longer than the actual throwing sequence for the dog to get the adrenaline out of the system. And if we don't do that, we leave the dog with a high adrenaline level, which is, again, a stress hormone. So we have a higher stress level still. And we don't need that, right? We switched to nose work. So sniffing exercises that was very easy in the beginning, but Giselle had a real talent for them and she loved doing them. So they could make them harder and harder and harder, and that taught Giselle to actually concentrate on something and not get distracted that easily by the environment. Because let's be honest, teenagers often have the attention span of a fly, right? And if we can teach them to concentrate on something fun, it's easier to teach them to concentrate on us. So that was the first step. Also, we switched to a harness and a long line. Because the shorter the line, the more frustrating it gets. Because the dog has to adjust the pace according to how fast we walk, and that's usually a lot slower than the dog would on his or her own. So a long line provides more freedom and still keeping the dog safe. And Giselle loved exploring. You could really see that she was relieved and excited to explore and sniff and do all those things. So that took a lot of pressure off. And then training started. And it was not much left, to be honest. She didn't pull on the long line at all. And when they used the shorter leash, she would pull, but not that much. So I like to use an area where the dog is not that excited and in a good mood already, and when the people are in a good mood as well. So we do have training times and non-training times. That also takes a lot of pressure off. And during the training sequences, yes, We use a short leash, and I like to use a cue to tell the dog now is training mode. Some people like to switch to the collar instead. Some people like to use a very distinct leash, like a leash that is a lot heavier than the long line or a lot lighter or something like that. So the dog has to be able to recognize the different modes. That is the point behind it. And then we just reward for loose leash. And if we reward quickly enough, there is no pulling. So the dog learns that in this new mode, there is always a radius around mom that grants them a reward once in a while. So staying in that radius is actually awesome. And that is what we want to accomplish with training. We want to set our dogs up for success. We want them to not make any mistakes during training. And yes, that goes for every training, but for leash pulling, it's even more important because we want to unlearn the pulling, right? And Giselle was really food motivated after we got the stress level down. In the beginning, she was actually not. She was just nose to the ground and sniffing like crazy. But as soon as we got stress level down, she was actually very food motivated. And that is another sign. If your dog cannot eat outside, check the stress level. Because your dog has to eat, right? It's a primary need. And if your dog is not open to that at all outside, it's very likely that there is something stressing your dog. So as soon as we got that down, Giselle was actually very food motivated. She worked wonderfully, and you could see that something in her changed from being annoyed by mom because she always wanted something and it was always overwhelming, and then it was frustrating, and she could never figure out what she had to do to stop that. She started to see mom as somebody who could provide fun and great stuff and yummy food, and who was actually somebody you could enjoy spending time with. And yes, you can see that in your dog's eyes. So that is why it's so important to start with stress release in the beginning of any leash pulling training. And a lot of times we don't even need training after that because the pulling was just a sign of stress. On the other hand, if we just treat the symptoms and just try to work on the leash pulling, sometimes that's successful too, but more often than not, it's just frustrating again. So I'd love to hear from you if your dog is pulling on the leash and if you have already checked the stress level and what you have found out. So tell me in the comments, in a review, in an email, however you would like, and have a lot of fun training, have a lot of fun relaxing with your dog. Until next time, bye.